Hello everyone, peace be upon you. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and stay with me until the end of the story. Also, leave a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story has reached. For those of you who have already subscribed, I sincerely wish you good health, ease in all your affairs, abundant blessings, and may all your hopes and dreams come true. Amen. Now, let's begin the story. Dust hung over the Afghan valley like a thin film on glass, turning distance into guesswork for anyone who didn't live behind a scope. Natalie Pierce did. The world narrowed to wind ticks and heat shimmer, to mirage boiling above a balcony 2 clicks out. She lay prone in a hide she'd built from rock and patience, cheek welded to the stock, pulse smoothed until the crosshair drifted on a slow tide of breath. The numbers wrote themselves in her head: temperature, pressure, wind angle, spin drift, Coriolis, all converted into tiny, precise corrections she no longer needed to see on a card. On the balcony, the man stepped forward into the light, the brief pause she'd been waiting for. Natalie let half a breath go and pressed. Recoil nudged her shoulder, the report rolled downrange long after the bullet arrived. The figure snapped back, collapsed, and the balcony swallowed him. Target down, she whispered. It sounded like a weather update. Years later, in North Carolina, fluorescent lights hummed above steel racks and rifle cases at Fort Liberty. Same hands, different life. Natalie's fingers moved across a bolt assembly like a mechanic who loved the engine more than the car. She logged serials, checked optics, felt carbon on the rag and cleaned until it disappeared. The armory door bucked once, and Staff Sergeant Mark Reynolds stepped in with red clay caked to his boots. Morning, Pierce. Brass wants ranges 1 through 4 hot by 08. Long line on 5. She nodded without looking up. Targets are repaired. Ammo is staged. Range 5 wind flags are calibrated. He smirked. You and your flags. She let the comment pass. Outside the high windows, pine tops bent just enough to add a click of wind at 300. She filed that away because her brain did it whether she asked or not. Her apartment was as spare as the armory, couch tight to a wall, sight lines on the lot, blinds set so she could see without being seen. A framed topo map hung above the table, just a map to anyone else, but her pencil marks were ranges only she understood. She slept with a Glock on the nightstand, woke to coffee and quiet, and walked to work early enough that no one noticed she parked where she could get out fast. It wasn't fear. It was habit, the kind that keeps you alive until you forget why you needed it. Word moved fast on base when brass changed. By midweek the talk had a name: Colonel Richard Hayes, former Special Operations, reputation built on results and long days. Natalie expected footprints in the sand to fade, hers never did. Late morning, the door opened and a man filled the space without raising his voice. Mid-40s, lean, eyes that read rooms the way hers did. Colonel Hayes, he said, offering it like a courtesy rather than a rank. Looking for the M110S that came in yesterday. Yes, sir, Natalie said, already moving. She unlocked the cage and slid a crate out, set one rifle in his hands. He slung the bolt, watched the lugs lock, checked trigger take-up without crowding it, then sighted down the bore like muscle memory. Upgraded optics, she said, keeping it simple. He studied her a half-beat longer than small talk requires. You run a tight armory, Miss Pierce. I keep the paperwork honest, sir. It was the truth and also not. He set the rifle down with care. A second later, another presence stepped in behind him, older, posture still parade ground straight, hair white and neat, a leather jacket that had seen flights and briefings in equal measure. General Thomas Whitaker, Hayes said. The name hit like a distant thunderclap. You didn't have to meet a legend for the legend to know you. Whitaker's eyes were winter gray and steady. Pierce. Just the name, like he was testing how it fit in the room. Sir, she said, neutral. The general's look wasn't hostile, just measuring. Not a threat check, an inventory. He asked about armory layout, about parts flow, about how she handled choke points on busy days. She answered with clean sentences and nothing extra, hands busy, posture relaxed, feet set where she could move if she had to. It was a conversation about rifles that never mentioned shooting. When they left, the air felt thinner. She finished the M24, logged it, rechecked a torque value she already knew was right, and told herself to stop lining up exits in a building she walked every day. That night, the dreams didn't come, the silence did. It was louder. 2 days later, Hayes returned without fanfare, the general beside him, and the edge was off courtesy. "Ms. Pierce," the colonel said, "we'll need you in the briefing room." No rank pulled, no theater. Just a direction. She locked the cage, washed carbon from her hands until the water ran clear, then followed them down a hall that smelled like wax tile and old paint. The secure room was all glass screens and cold chairs. A satellite image waited on the main display, white-on-white mountains around a dark grid of buildings carved into Alaskan snow. Raven Rock Facility. Even in grayscale it looked like a problem. Reynolds stuck his head in, realized the air was different, and backed out with a quick, "Sorry, ma'am." Doors sealed. Hayes stood at the screen. 6 hours ago, Raven Rock lost contact. Multiple armed actors. Hostages taken. We assessed 12 hostile, maybe more. Whitaker didn't sit. He watched Natalie watch the map. "We're still confirming." His voice carried time in it, not volume. She told her eyes to be civilian and failed. Approaches were narrow, fields of fire good for defenders, a single road pinched by snowbanks and concrete. She traced the ridgeline with a glance and knew what could be done from there and how ugly it would be in wind. "Who's running it?" she asked before she decided not to. Hayes tapped a photo that looked pulled from a camera that didn't want to be seen. A hard face with years carved in, hair cut to gray, gaze like a level. Viktor Dragunov. Former Spetsnaz. Intelligent, disciplined, patient. The name dropped like a coin in a well and hit something at the bottom. Syria came back in one frame, a street, a balcony, a civilian stepping where he shouldn't, a shot held when it would have been easy to take and wrong, a blast 2 days later, folded flags, 7 names. She kept her face steady, but Whitaker saw what he was looking for. He didn't say it. Hayes didn't either. The colonel's tone stayed even. "We're evaluating options. The terrain complicates a conventional assault. Weather isn't friendly. We'll need Overwatch to break their structure if we go." Her pulse didn't jump, it settled. The map got sharper, distances turned to numbers she didn't have to write down. A ridge east-northeast, long sight lines, clean angles on command nodes if you found them. A shot could thread the gap. If you trusted yourself more than the weather. "Why me?" she asked, quiet. Whitaker gave a small nod like a teacher who finally got the question he wanted. "Because you see it," he said. "And because sometimes the person we need is the one who already decided never to do it again." Hayes added, "No one is asking you to say yes. But if you do, we do it on your terms." She didn't answer. Not yet. After, she walked the rack rows alone, fingertips skimming hard polymer and cold steel, pausing at a case with a name she didn't use anymore. In the locker mirror, the face looking back was older than the valley in Afghanistan and younger than the 7th folded flag. She locked the door and moved on. At first light, wind cut low across the ranges, carrying the sour dirt smell of the berms. Reynolds joked about coffee that could strip paint. She smiled because that's what people do when they're rehearsing normal. Then she stood in the doorway and watched flags show gusts she could feel on her skin. She thought about a ridge in Alaska and a man who liked to hide inside other people's bodies. She thought about the clean simplicity of a life that involved serial numbers and oil, and the mess that comes back when you admit you were built for something else. The choice wasn't between quiet and noise. It was between pretending and telling the truth. By noon, she had her answer. She called Hayes from the back room where the signal was best and said, "If I do this, I pick the rifle, the glass, and the route. I work the ridge alone. You talk to me, no one else." He didn't hesitate. "Understood." Whitaker's voice came on after a click, calm as winter. "Then let's get you what you need." Natalie hung up, exhaled once through her nose, and opened the locker with the case she'd told herself she'd never touch again. The latches sounded louder than the humming lights. The rifle looked like a past life and a tool she still knew down to the last thread. She ran her hand along the stock and didn't think about ghosts. She thought about wind, and angles, and a ridge that would not forgive guessing. Then she closed the case and carried the weight like it belonged to her again. By late afternoon the armory had that empty sound it gets when the last range shuts down. Mark Reynolds poked his head in, saw the look she wore when she was already somewhere else, and chose jokes over questions. "Don't forget to lock up, Pierce. Brass loves a checklist." She nodded, logged out, and drove with the radio off, counting the green lights without noticing any of them. Hayes waited in a windowless room that smelled like recycled air and fresh printer toner. He slid a folder across. No drama, just facts. Satellite passes, thermal overlays, patrol loops that made sense if you'd spent your life herding problems into corners. Whitaker stood behind him, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes on her face and not the screen. "Say your terms again," the general said. She did, slow and plain, her rifle, her glass, her route, ridge alone, comms only with Hayes. "Done," he said, as if he'd already signed it hours ago. Hayes added the one thing that sounded like trust, not control. "We'll stage the assault 5 clicks out. We move when you open the door." They took her down 2 levels to a cage with no label. The biometric lock buzzed and the doors swung wide on cold, familiar smells, oil, steel, desiccant. Her case waited in the middle like it had been asleep, not retired. She checked everything without rushing: barrel crown, bolt lugs, trigger take-up, zero stop on the turret, the faint burr she'd never filed off the mag catch because it told her, in the dark, which rifle was hers. Ammunition came sealed, hand-loaded, verified on a scale that didn't lie. She built the kit in silence: base layers, white ghillie, slim gloves, compact rangefinder, spotter scope because she trusted her eyes more than any number, a small thermals unit she'd use only to confirm what she already knew. The flight was a C-17 ride swallowed by midnight. Operators tried to sleep in rows, she didn't. Hayes came back once and sat opposite, boots braced, elbows on knees. "You sure?" he asked, meaning everything and nothing. "I'm already there," she said. He nodded like he believed her, then briefed weather: Arctic air biting hard, northwest wind 25 gusting higher, blowing spindrift that would hide you and betray you in the same breath. Whitaker appeared for the last 10 minutes before descent, set a folded map on her knee, paper, not pixels. A thin pencil line traced an approach that cut wind exposure and climbed under dead ground. It matched what she would have chosen. He didn't ask for confirmation. He just said, "Don't let him turn you into yesterday." Raven Rock lived inside a bowl of white and rock. They dropped the assault package in a sheltered draw, engines flaring and gone. Natalie stepped into air that clawed the skin and turned breath to frost. Sound died fast here, even fabric had a different noise. She checked comms, quiet ping, Hayes steady in her ear, and started the climb alone, hips carrying the rifle, hands free, lungs working against knives of cold. The ridge she'd picked from space was rougher up close, a stack of broken slabs layered with ice and old snow. She moved like she'd practiced this place, weight low, pausing when the gusts made the world shift half an inch. Halfway up, she glassed the facility from a shadowed notch. Patterns surfaced quickly: 2 rooftop shooters, 4 perimeter pairs, 1 heavy gun watching the main road, vehicles idling in a motor court to keep batteries alive. The hostages weren't visible, but heat signatures pulsed soft through the walls, clustered, not scattered. Bad for assault timing, good for predicting leverage. She marked 3 likely command nodes by behavior, not location: the guy who didn't repeat himself on the radio, the one people glanced at before moving, the one who never looked busy because busy people report to him. One of those would be Dragunov, or close enough to hurt. As she crawled the last meters into the nest she'd chosen, the wind stiffened, peeling spindrift across the ridge like smoke. Perfect for concealment, ugly for precision. She built the position the way you build a lie that has to last: careful, shallow, nothing that would silhouette when the moon bullied through the cloud. The rifle settled into the bipod and the earth found its level under her bones. She ranged key angles twice, once with glass and once with feel. The numbers were a starting point. Trust came from the way the crosshair sat when her breath turned to a line instead of a tide. Pierce, status, Hayes said, soft. In position, she answered. Visual confirms rooftop pairs, heavy at the road, motor court vehicles warm. Comms mast on admin roof looks like their hub. Lights are fixed grids, not motion activated. Copy. Assault holds at phase line Bravo. Whitaker came up clean a beat later. Remember Berlin, he said, not for poetry but because he'd learned something there no manual covers. She didn't need the story. She understood the rule: when a man's plan depends on your predictability, remove the part of you he thinks he understands. Night chewed the edges of the facility until it sat in a tight ring of artificial light. The wind flicked between steady and petty, the kind of variability that ruins good math. She watched, and the watching did what it always did: time lost its teeth. Dragunov finally showed himself not by face but by the wake he set in those around him. Routes opened, chatter shortened, the roof pair shifted 5 paces to get a cleaner line they didn't need until someone told them to take it. He crossed a patch of yard alone like he owned the snow. Her fingers settled to first stage without her asking it to. Hold, Hayes said, already reading the scene the way she did. We need hostage placement before we cut the head. She held because the mission was larger than relief. A minute later, the first string of civilians appeared under guard, hands up against cold they couldn't prepare for. Dragunov slid his angle to live inside their bodies, same old trick, brand new winter. Natalie tasted metal at the back of her tongue, the ridge pushed the breath out of her and kept it. She reset, let the urge burn off like fog under sun, and looked past the obvious kill to the system that needed breaking. Comms, light, overwatch, the tripod any siege sits on. She plotted a lane that would take all 3 in 2 breaths and create a shape of chaos that forced hands off triggers and onto radios. I can open, she said, and Hayes didn't ask how. On you. Before the first shot, she adjusted something smaller than a click inside herself, the permission to be exactly what she tried not to be for 3 quiet years. The crosshair climbed the admin mast and settled. The wind paused like it was listening. She pressed clean. The antenna sparked and died. The second shot took a gate light and turned half the yard to black glass. The third slid a rooftop shooter off his comfort and turned him into a shout. Sirens tried to wake and choked. Voices piled up on one frequency and stepped on each other's feet. Dragunov moved, not fast, just exact, angling for cover that used a hostage as a wall. Assault is green when you say, Hayes said. Natalie kept her cheek on the stock and tracked the pattern Dragunov made in the dark. Somewhere in that pattern was the fissure she could pry open. She felt the ridge breathe around her and the rifle turn into the only honest sentence she had left. The yard below staggered under sudden dark, radios barking over each other, men moving because silence had broken and habit filled the gap. Natalie let the crosshair ride the chaos without chasing it. Chasing gets you killed. Reading keeps you patient. Dragunov drifted along the hostage's edge, a shadow built from angles and nerve, always keeping a body between himself and consequence. He didn't hurry. He didn't have to. He believed the math was on his side. Pierce, report, Hayes whispered, voice sanded down to calm. Comms hub down. One rooftop element disrupted. Lights halved. Perimeter is confused, not blind, she said. Primary is using civilians as moving cover. A breath of static, then Whitaker, he'll press your limits. That's the point. Find a line he didn't draw. Wind stiffened across the ridge, a push that built and eased like a tide gone wrong. She compensated a hair, less than a click, more than faith, and watched the motor court come alive. A Humvee sat broadside to the research building, hood steaming, one rear door open. Two men wrestled a hard case from the lab entrance, 1 meter long, heavy for two, carried like it mattered more than their fingers. Her gut labeled it before her brain offered the word. Argus. Even from here she could feel the gravity around it, the way people made room. Visual on a hardened case moving from lab, she said. Looks like primary objective. Hayes didn't waste syllables. Copy. If they roll with both hostages and package, we bleed options. Another voice clipped onto the net, new but steady, the kind that lives around labs and deadlines. This is Dr. Alan Brooks. That case matches our prototype dimensions. If it leaves the site intact, he stopped, as if the rest didn't need air. Whitaker filled it anyway. We're not letting it. Natalie scanned for counter-sniper positions. The two on the roofs had shifted, one rattled by her earlier work, the other calmer, watching for a ghost he'd only heard about in stories told too late at night. She tagged both lanes, stored ranges like landmarks. Beyond them, thermal shimmered on a second-floor corner of admin curtains twitched. A figure set his shoulders the way command sets them. Dragunov wouldn't sit there long, he liked to touch the ground he owned. The first hostage string crossed open space, heads down against wind and fear, guards tight, fingers too close to triggers. Dragunov slid into their shape and became negative space, present because the light bent around him. Every time she found a lane, a civilian drifted a foot and ruined it. Her fingers stayed on first stage. Patience tasted like metal. Weather window narrows, Hayes said. Gusts building. Assault needs your go. She didn't answer right away. The path forward looked like what Whitaker had taught by not saying, don't fight the trap where it's strongest. Move sideways. She shifted to infrastructure again. Yard lights she hadn't touched yet. A second relay on the admin wall. The motor court camera dome watching the only clean exit. She took the relay, glass spidered and died, then kissed the camera with a round that left it spinning uselessly to the ground. The guards flinched toward sound they couldn't place. Dragunov showed the first hint of irritation, a small, sharp hand signal that pulled two men off the line to check a roof sector she'd already burned. In the gap, a hostage stumbled, and everything could have tipped. It didn't. Not yet. Brooks came back, tighter now. If Argus powers while mobile, it can bootstrap with limited data. That means Nemesis might. He swallowed the word like it was an admission. Natalie finished it for him. Predict the ridge. Predict me. Silence admitted what no one wanted on record. She watched the case dip into the Humvee's rear and felt the world make a choice that didn't include her. Pierce, Hayes said, a notch lower. She cut him off gently. Understood. She mapped the Humvee's angles, the way its panels met, where paint sat over steel, where steel met the cube of a standard shipping container parked 5 feet to its left. The container wall was flat, cold, and honest. Metal remembers impact in ways wind can't touch. A thought took shape, not as theory, but as feel, the path around might take if it found one surface to borrow and another to finish. Dragunov reappeared, one hand on a hostage's collar, using the man like a hinge to pivot his chest away from any straight line. He talked into his mic as if ordering takeout. Calm breeds obedience. He started moving the column toward the vehicles, picking his moment like a surgeon picks an incision. The shot she wanted didn't exist. The shot she needed might. She nudged the scope to the container side facing her. No dents, no ribs, a clean plane with a faint frost sheen. A spark at the right spot would hold just long enough for truth to change direction. Distance was ugly, near 2 clicks, and wind was worse, but ricochets are less about luck than about how deeply you understand the way metal forgives and redirects. Her chest went quiet. The ridge exhaled. "Hayes," she said. "I have an indirect solution. High risk. Ricochet off container into target's exposed quadrant. Hostage safety margin is centimeter thin." He didn't fill the line with lectures. Probability. She could have said numbers. Instead, she gave him the only metric that mattered when numbers lied. "I can feel it." A beat, then Whitaker, "Authorization granted. You're the only one who gets to decide if the shot exists." She rebuilt the world in her scope, not man, not metal, not wind, but a corridor of space bent twice. She eased her shoulder, settled the bipod a finger-width deeper, took a breath down to where her pulse stopped kicking at the glass, and let memory ride the math. Afghanistan's balcony, Iraq's oilfield mirage, Yemen's heat shimmer, 100 shots that taught her where air hangs heavy and where it lets go. The crosshair rested not where Dragunov was, not where the container stood, but where the second path would be after the first decision the bullet made. Below, the convoy flexed. The heavy gun swung uncertain, then centered on the road, daring the dark to come honest. A guard waved his rifle like a baton to rush the last hostages. Dragunov leaned in to bark a command, jaw turning, collarbone lifting a fraction out from behind his shield. The window arrived and threatened to close in the same heartbeat. Wind hissed and flattened. She watched for the micro-tremor in the flags near the gate, down, then still. Her finger came through first stage like a whisper. Trigger wall. Wait. Break. She didn't fire. Not yet. She held inside that perfect stillness because the hostage in Dragunov's hands took one terrified step the wrong direction, angling his shoulder into the very slice Natalie needed to keep clean. The difference between heroics and manslaughter is sometimes a single heartbeat you refuse to steal. Hold, she breathed, to herself more than anyone. The heartbeat passed. The hostage flinched the other way on a shout she couldn't hear. The path reopened, 1 degree wider, and the ridge seemed to lean forward with her. Natalie took that half-second the world offered and made it work. The crosshair sat not on Dragunov, not on the container's paint, but on the invisible corner where physics and nerve touch hands. She pressed. The rifle bucked with a tight, honest recoil. Sound went late, as always, swallowed by wind and distance. Through glass, time stretched long enough to count one slow beat. The round struck the container with a hard spark, a pinprick of light on frozen steel, then bent its will and left that face at a new angle, riding the line she'd felt before she believed it. Dragunov jerked like a cable had yanked him from behind. His grip broke. The hostage dropped to a knee, hands instinctively shielding his head. Dragunov staggered back 2 steps, free arm clamping his upper chest just below the collarbone. He didn't fall, stubborn, trained, angry, but the shape of the fight changed. Target hit, Natalie said, voice level. Hostage clear. Hayes didn't waste the moment. Assault, move. The net bloomed with controlled violence, short acknowledgements, positions called, engines flaring from their high to mask boot crunch on snow. Natalie shifted to the roof pair. The rattled shooter tried to find a lane on the motor court. She cut his scope with a round that spalled the parapet brick beside his cheek, then took his partner clean when he leaned too far into a bad habit. The heavy gun at the road pivoted, uncertain about where the threat lived, and chattered a burst that stitched nothing useful. She kissed the feed tray cover with a shot that snapped the latch and turned the team's pride into dead weight. Down in the yard, Dragunov made a decision only men built for command make under hurt. He tried to finish the plan anyway. He barked a cut-short order, shoved the wounded shoulder into compliance, and dragged the operation back toward motion. 2 hostiles grabbed the Argus case and muscled it deeper into the Humvee. Another reached for the driver's door. Natalie slid around into the hood seam where battery cable meets cold metal, and the engine's last hope coughed to silence. The driver swore and slammed his palm on the wheel, that hand would never help him again if he showed it outside the glass. Breach 1, a calm voice on the net called. Delta's lead element hit the admin door with a charge that folded the frame inward like cheap tin. White snow sucked in dark smoke. Flash out. The yard strobed once, then twice. Shots cracked fast and then stopped. Professional work, short cycles, cleared rooms. East stairwell secure. Moving. Natalie floated her scope, watching the places men appear when they're scared and trained at the same time. She found one cutting across the roof to a ladder and put him face down before his boots found the first rung. Another tried to sprint the shadow line behind the lab. He didn't make the corner. Dragunov got smarter and lower. He slid behind the Humvee's rear wheel, turned the hostage stream into a knot, and reached his pistol hand across his body like pain didn't have jurisdiction. The move wasn't for show. He lined for a shot into the back of a civilian leg to create instant leverage. Natalie read it a breath before he committed and shaved the rubber from the tire inches from his wrist, a slap that forced his aim down and instinct back into self-preservation. He shifted to use the vehicle's frame as a wedge. That was fine. Wedges have edges, and edges leave gaps. Pierce, we have hostages clustered in Lab 2, Hayes said, voice low but urgent. Can you hold exterior pressure? Holding, she answered, and she did. Shooting targets you can't see is panic, shooting the things they need is control. She chewed another light, then the backup relay someone thought was hidden, then the small dish that fed a handheld set on a guard's shoulder. With each snap of glass or metal, the defender's world shrank. Confusion does work better than fear. Confusion makes men ask the wrong questions. Breach 2. Another controlled thunderclap. Stairwell west secured. 4 hostages recovered. 1 hostile down. The motor court shifted tone, the noise of fight moved inside, leaving the open snow to Natalie and the wind. She scanned for the second rooftop shooter she'd rattled earlier. He'd gone to ground, but elbows and egos always rise when they think they see the ghost. He gave himself away with a breath plume and the tiniest shine of lens. She didn't aim at the lens, she aimed at the inch of air the bullet would occupy when it pushed Frost aside. The round arrived where it had been invited. Dragunov's voice carried again, thinner now, pushed through a throat that had learned not to tremble. He tried to rally the perimeter into a counterpunch, push on the road, peel left, collapse the inside men onto the assault. It would have been neat on a whiteboard. It died in snow and steel. Outer gate is ours, a Delta voice said. Holding vehicles. Moving to lab door. Copy, Hayes answered. Pierce, eyes on primary. Primary wounded, using rear wheel as cover. He's stable enough to be dangerous. I can't take a clean head. We prefer him breathing, Whitaker added, which meant intelligence had decided the man who ruined good sleep for years was worth more talking than bleeding out. The Argus case still sat partially inside the Humvee, messy and heavy, its clamps askew. A guard grabbed for it again, desperate to move meaning out of this yard. Natalie put a round into the right rear shock so the chassis sank and the case shifted. The guard yelled and let the load go before it pinned his hand. Options kept slipping out of Dragunov's fingers like rope ice. Inside the lab wing, the fight compressed. Contact came flat and close on the net, followed by 2 fast shots and 1 slower one. Hallway clear. Door right barricaded. Manual breach, someone said. Stand by. Natalie watched the second-floor windows for rearguard movement. A figure thrown by flashbang light tried to vault a desk for a better shot. He didn't land the way he planned. Another dropped a rifle to clasp both hands over ears that rang too loud to hear. She left him for the team that would zip-tie his wrists and keep him honest. Dragunov finally ran out of smart places to hide. Blood found the seam of his jacket and wrote a line down his side. He scanned the yard with a predator's calm and did the thing the good ones do when the shape of defeat is clear. He changed goals. Survival first, not victory. He broke from cover with a burst that surprised the men near him into a flinch, grabbed the nearest hostage by the collar again, and used the body like a door he could carry. He angled for the admin corner where a blind spot waited under a camera she'd already killed. Natalie took half a breath and let it go. Angles in motion demand you trust the draw you made 3 seconds earlier. She shifted an inch left, tracked the hostage's head and shoulders for the void that was not allowed to be hers, and touched the trigger the way you turn a page you've read too many times. The round hit Dragunov lower than the first, forward of the lat, deep enough to make the arm that held leverage go slack. The hostage fell free and crawled like instinct had drawn a map under him. Dragunov swung a half step, stumbled, and found the ground with one knee. He tried to stand on habit alone. Habit lost to blood. Primary down, Natalie said. Moving. She didn't mean herself. Delta's outside pair flowed in from the flank, stacked, and took him like professionals take a prize, hard, fast, no theatrics. One man pinned the gun hand, the other cinched a tourniquet high on the wounded shoulder before the brain could feint its way out of answer time. They rolled him, searched quick and rough, and left him cuffed by the rear bumper he'd tried to make a wall. Lab 2 secure, the net called, relief buried under training. 15 hostages accounted, 1 minor injury. Negative friendly casualties. Natalie let that line soak in for 1 count, then went back to work, because fights hold their breath for ambushes when they feel over. She checked corners of roof and yard, the places where a last man tries to earn a legend or a mistake. One popped from the shadow of a generator shed, took 2 hurried shots toward the lab door, and ate a consequence before he could wonder why it felt cold. Package located, another voice said. Argus case recovered. Integrity seals intact. Dr. Brooks came back on the net, and this time his breath actually registered. Copy. Do not power it here. Transport cold. I'll meet you at the secondary. Hayes, affirmative. Eagle moving. No slogans, no cheers, just work. The kind you remember years later when a clock hits the minute the first shot went true. Snow began to fall again, lazy flakes that didn't know what they'd landed in. Sirens died. Voices shrank to task volume. Natalie let her cheek come off the stock for the first time in too long and felt the ridge under her like a hand on a shoulder, solid and quiet. The rifle lay there like it had always been part of this rock. She scanned one more full cycle, then another, because discipline is what you do after everyone else stops looking. Pierce, Hayes said, back to calm. Status. Overwatch green. No fresh movement. Perimeter secure. Copy. Hold until convoy rolls. Then exfil on route Delta to pickup 2. Whitaker slid onto the net for the first time since authorization. Good hunting, he said, the closest he ever came to congratulations. She didn't answer that. Some things are better kept in the space between words. Medics hustled Dragunov to a stretcher with a blanket thrown over the chest that tried to bleed through gauze and tape. He turned his head once, scanning the white bowl for a shape he would never see. If he suspected the ridge, he didn't get the comfort of proof. Natalie watched him go without heat. The ledger that mattered to her had 1 line crossed out and 7 lines underlined, and none of it brought anyone back. The assault team flowed the hostages out under low voices and blankets that shook in the wind. Men and women walked like newborn deer, legs learning ground again. One stumbled near the Humvee and put a hand on the container like he needed to feel something solid. Natalie checked his face through glass. He was the one Dragunov had used as a hinge. The man looked up once toward the east ridge, to a spot that was empty to him, and mouthed something like a thank you to nowhere. Engines warmed on cue. Headlights stayed dark. The convoy rolled without sharp turns, discipline holding to the last gate. Convoy moving, Hayes confirmed. Pierce, you're clear to collapse position. She worked the rifle down with the same care she'd used to build the shot, bolt open, chamber checked, suppressor cooled enough to stow. She brushed snow from the bipod feet and covered the small pressed place her body had made in the world. People talk about ghosts like they're magic. Mostly they're just careful. On the walk back off the ridge, wind cut across her face and wrote numbness on skin she hadn't noticed since insertion. The night felt both heavier and lighter. Heavier because adrenaline had exited and left weight. Lighter because the choice she'd made not to steal a heartbeat before firing had kept her ledger clean. Hayes came up on the net again as her boots found the draw. "We'll debrief at the forward site, 30 out of Fairbanks," he said. "Whitaker wants first words. Brooks will bring coffee you won't like but we'll drink." She didn't say she'd drink anything warm. She just said, "Copy," and let the dark close behind her like snow erasing a trail. At the LZ, rotors beat the cold into something they could climb. The team loaded without chatter. Dragunov lay strapped and quiet under a medic's watch, eyes open, thoughts working. Natalie stepped up last and caught a final look at Raven Rock. Lights were broken in useful places. Doors hung crooked where plans had failed. In the small window, she saw her reflection, older than the first balcony, steadier than the 7 flags, exactly as she needed to be for whatever came next. The bird lifted. Alaska fell away in clean white and sharp black. The ridge stayed where it was, waiting for weather and the next person honest enough to lie still on its back. In the rotor wash and diesel breath of the bird, Natalie let Alaska shrink to a hard white coin under the night. No cheers. No speeches. Just straps, cold gear, and the slow thaw of fingers that had held steadier things than promises. Dragunov lay 2 liters forward under a medic's quiet vigilance, eyes open, jaw clenched against morphine he couldn't refuse. He didn't look back at her because he didn't know where to look. That suited her fine. Some debts don't need eye contact to exist. Fairbanks hit like a fluorescent hanger and bad coffee. The forward site was a box with heaters that worked and walls that pretended they were enough. Teams cycled through Deccan checks, weapons were cleared, bags dumped, boots lined up like they were tired of standing on their own. Hayes took her to a small room with a table scarred by other nights and a screen that hummed without trying. Whitaker stood with hands on the back of a chair, not sitting, not pacing, a man who'd learned that stillness draws truth faster than questions. Brooks hovered near a tray of mugs, steam lifting like hope from things that crack if you hold them too tight. "Walk it," Hayes said, not writing, not recording, just listening. Natalie laid the night out in clean lines: insertion, climb, read, cut comms, collapse perimeter, primary wounded, package secured, hostages safe. She named her Mrs. 2, the fractions you bury if you want a legend more than a ledger. The first rooftop warning shot she'd taken a beat late. The motor court camera she could have taken with 2 fewer breaths. The half-inch she'd left herself on the ricochet because a man had moved and she'd chosen to let him. Whitaker didn't interrupt. When she finished, he nodded once, like a clock ticking over. Brooks slid a mug across. "Argus seals intact. We'll do a cold transfer and scrub every log," he said, voice careful, like he knew she wasn't here for lab talk but needed to hear the edges anyway. "If Nemesis captured anything in the outage window, we'll find it before anyone else does. And if it mapped any part of your pattern, we'll salt the earth." Natalie sipped, winced at the taste, drank again. "Salt it twice," she said. He gave a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Plan was never to replace judgment," he added, more to the room than to her. "Augment. That's the word that keeps getting lost when budgets start talking." They let the silence breathe. Out on the hangar floor, someone laughed too loud at something that was probably not funny. Adrenaline has to leak somewhere. Hayes finally slid a paper across the table, actual paper, not a screen, and a pen that wrote even in the cold. "Statement for the official, scrubbed version," he said. "You can sign with the truth you're willing to let live in a file." She didn't ask what that meant secondhand. She read the tidy paragraphs, crossed one sentence out, tightened another, and left the ricochet unnamed. Results matter in documents. Ethics live in the white space. Dragunov? She asked. Hayes tilted his head toward the far corner where two plain doors led to rooms with locks better than they looked. Surgery now, then holding, then a plane to the sort of hospital that makes people talk. Whitaker added, we'll treat him like we want people to treat ours. That's not mercy. That's policy. She understood. Policy keeps you from becoming the thing you spend your life containing. Hours scraped by until dark became gray. Someone brought eggs that tasted like they'd been stored near solvents. She ate anyway. Brooks briefed again, short, focused, the kind of talk that keeps panic from taking shape beneath the numbers. We've confirmed Argus never powered, he said. Nemesis was offline. Whatever Victor thought he'd walk out with, he didn't. We'll pull the drives in Fairbanks, truck them to a vault, and start fresh with different assumptions. He looked at Natalie when he said different, like the word needed a witness. When Whitaker finally sat, it was to shift the room from last night to next month. You're not coming back to an armory, not if I can help it, he said. You can. But I'd call that a waste. He slid a thin folder that wasn't about after-action anything. Camp Stonewall is standing up a course I should have built 10 years ago. We want shooters who can run numbers and then ignore them when the wind and the moment disagree. We want people who understand that the hardest part of a trigger pull is sometimes not pulling it. Hayes added, curriculum is yours to shape. Keep the best of the old, install the right parts of the new, throw out anything that lies. Brooks, careful, finish the pitch without selling. And I'll bring Argus in under that. Tools serve judgment. Not the other way. Natalie didn't answer fast. The armory had been penance dressed as routine, safety disguised as exile. Teaching meant admitting she had more to give than silence. It also meant building people who might be asked one day to do what she'd done on the ridge and worse, and telling them sometimes you pass and live with what you let happen. She stared at the pen again and realized she'd already signed something more binding on a mountain with her cheek on cold stock. What do I call the thing you want me to build? She asked. A school? Whitaker's mouth twitched. A conscience with a range. She snorted once, the closest she'd come to laughing in days. Fine, she said. But I pick staff and students with you, not for you. And we start with this, no one graduates who can't narrate a shot they never took and why. Hayes didn't need to look at anyone to agree. Done. Sleep showed up like a late apology and stayed just long enough to reset her edges. When she woke, dawn had found the windows and made the hangar look tired instead of haunted. Hayes walked her through the logistics like a father who refuses to be sentimental, a debrief at a higher level with people who pronounce risk like a currency, transport to Virginia under a name the base already knew, an office that used to be a closet and a range that wanted more wind meters and fewer myths. You'll have what you need, he said. You won't have everything you want. Sometimes that's useful. Before wheels up, she asked for 5 minutes with Dragunov. Hayes held her stare, then nodded. Door stays open. 2 minutes, he said. The room smelled like antiseptic and metal the way all rooms do when power decides who breathes. Dragunov lay pale, lines snaking from his arms, eyes flat with a kind of civility he wore like a suit. He watched her step into his world and didn't bother with a smile. You were always wind and patience, he said, accent thinner than memory, a voice that could sell or kill. It is ugly to be beaten by physics. She kept her hands still and her answers shorter than his pride. You were beaten by choices. He blinked like the word stung more than the wound. You did not kill me, he said, not a question. That wasn't the job, she said, and let the doorframe hold more of her weight than she showed. He angled his chin, conceding a game he'd try to replay later. Then we are not finished. We never were, she said, and left before he could turn that into a vow. The flight east traded white mountains for brown fields and then for the deep greens of Virginia. Camp Stonewall looked smaller than the stories she'd heard, ranges cut into woods, a squat tower that had seen rain more often than metals, classrooms with scuffed floors and chairs that shared screws. She walked it like a problem and a promise, measured wind lanes, mapped thermals the hill would cough up in August, felt where a kid with heart but no feel would send around to die. She started lists. Targets to swap. Berms to reshape. Glass to buy. She wrote ethics on the whiteboard and left it there like a dare. Students began to trickle in, names she didn't repeat out loud, faces that had seen sand, others that had only seen a recruiter's smile. She watched how they held a rifle the first time. She listened to how they talked about shots they'd made. She tested for how they carried the ones they hadn't. At night she wrote a new manual in her head, how not to lie to yourself in the moment you'll remember most. Brooks called in from a lab with boxes that hummed. "We're rewriting Argus," he said. "The version that tries to be you is dead. The version that listens to you lives." She told him to bring that box to the range and let it be wrong in wind until it learned humility. Word came that Whitaker's doctor had finally won a decade-long argument with Whitaker's calendar. He'd step back, nod away, slip into a role where his voice would carry without him standing in rooms that made his hands hurt in winter. He came down once more anyway, leaned on the bench, watched a kid miss and then miss better. "Build it so they can leave whole," he said. "Not happy. Just whole." She nodded. Happy was never the point. When the first class stood on the line for night shoots, Natalie walked behind them and heard a dozen breaths sink to triggers they hadn't learned to trust yet. She corrected grips with 2 fingers, moved bipods a 1/4 inch, told a story without names about a ridge that waited for weather and the day she didn't take a perfect shot because a man moved into a space that wasn't his to die in. "Sometimes the bravest thing you'll ever do is hold," she said, quiet enough the wind almost kept it. Shots went out and came back as small truths. A few found steel. One rang in a way that made everyone on the line stand taller without seeing who'd filmed it. Natalie didn't smile. She let the sound do the work. Later, alone in the office that used to be a closet, she set her rifle on the desk like a paperweight that could blow holes in lies. On the wall, she pinned a topo map of a place that wasn't Alaska and wasn't Carolina, just contours and angles. She drew no lines. She didn't need to. The ledger she kept now had new columns: who learned to wait, who learned to walk away from a shot they could make, who would keep the world more or less upright when no one was watching. Her phone buzzed once with a message Hayes wouldn't put in email: Dragunov stabilized, transferred, under lights too bright for schemes. "He's talking," the text read. "He wants you to know he'll see weather before you do." She typed nothing back. She turned off the screen. Outside, pines took wind they didn't fight and made it into a sound like ocean you hear through a wall. She stood there long enough to know that peace is not quiet, it's accuracy. And accuracy is not perfection, it's honesty under pressure. In the morning, she'd make them shoot in rain. Tonight, she let the range go dark and stay that way. Morning came with a clean sky and air that carried the promise of heat later, the kind that bends light above targets and makes new shooters doubt their math. Natalie walked the line as her students set rifles on bipods, saw their shoulders relax into the stock, heard the shuffle of boots on gravel. They were learning to breathe in the rhythm of steel, not glory. She corrected them with a hand on a shoulder, a nod toward a flag's lazy swing, a reminder that a trigger is not a command but a question. When they fired, the echoes rolled downrange into the trees, soft and exact, like a language they were just beginning to speak. By mid-afternoon, Brooks arrived from the lab, still smelling of server racks and coffee that had died hours earlier. He brought a compact case, lighter than Argus but carrying its shadow. "Integration module," he said, setting it on the bench like it wasn't worth reverence. "It listens. Doesn't tell. It measures your environment and offers a whisper, not an order." She glanced at the recruits, then back at him. "They don't need a whisper. They need to learn when silence is enough." Brooks nodded, maybe relieved. "That's why you're here," he said, and left the box unopened until she chose. Whitaker came that evening, slower now, cane in hand, though he pretended it was just for balance. He watched the class run through dry drills and then drifted to her side. "Legacy isn't shots fired," he murmured. "It's standards carried forward when you're not here to enforce them." She caught the way his hand trembled when he smoothed his coat, saw the weight he carried in silence. She wanted to tell him the program was already his legacy, but words felt like ceremony, and ceremony wasn't his language. Instead she just said, "They'll be ready." That earned her a rare, brief smile that softened the lines around his eyes. "That's all I ever wanted," he said, and left before fatigue betrayed him. Night settled over Camp Stonewall with crickets louder than the distant road. Natalie sat alone in her office, topo maps pinned with new marks, notes scattered in her own tight script. She thought of the ridge in Alaska, of the container that had turned her round into an impossible arc, of Dragunov dropping without surrender. She thought of the man in the infirmary afterward, speaking with pride even as blood soaked his jacket. "We are not finished," he had said. And she believed him. Ghosts don't vanish because the paperwork says mission complete. They wait. They plan. They test the fences. Hundreds of miles west, in a concrete wing of Red Rock Federal Prison, Dragunov sat in a wheelchair by a reinforced window. The scar along his chest still pulled with every breath. Guards believed the sedatives made him dull. He let them. Behind his eyes, the network still lived, men who owed him, men who feared him, men who believed in nothing but the paycheck that came with his orders. He had built it over decades, in whispers and favors, and a prison wall wasn't enough to erase it. The Americans thought the game had ended in Alaska. He knew better. The hunt had simply reset. His lips curved faintly as snow began to fall outside, a mirror of the ridge where she had marked him. "Until next time," he muttered in Russian, a vow dressed as a promise. Back in Virginia, Natalie turned the lights off and let the darkness of her office match the woods beyond. She had choices now: teach, build, stay, or disappear again if the weight grew too heavy. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to run. Purpose had replaced hiding. The ledger was still written in quiet lines only she could see, but new columns had appeared, students trained, standards passed down, conscience stitched into curriculum. Maybe that mattered more than the 121 marks whispered about in halls she'd never walk again. She locked up, stepped outside, and breathed air that smelled of pine and gun oil carried on clothes. Stars showed faint between clouds, the same stars that had once watched her hold a trigger in foreign dust, the same that had watched her let go in Syria when one life blocked 7. She remembered Whitaker's words, "Sometimes the hardest part is knowing when not to shoot." That lesson was the truest target she had ever hit. She carried it now, ready to hand it to the next hand steady enough to hold it. As she walked back across the gravel lot, she glanced once over her shoulder at the dark tree line. No movement, no threat, just the habit that never left. Somewhere out there, Dragunov waited in the shape of the future, planning angles as carefully as she did. She accepted that. Ghosts are defined not by their kills but by the shadows they leave in others. And in that balance, she found peace, not quiet, but accuracy. The range, the students, the work, all of it would continue. She had stepped out of the shadows, not to vanish again, but to build something that might last longer than any shot ever fired.